And our next speaker is going to give us a bit of a historical view on that. She's from Stanford. She came after a very long travel. Please help me welcome Anaïs St-Jude. Welcome, Anaïs.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg, information overload and social networks. Who here feels like they're suffering from information overload? I do see some hands. Wow, okay. And who is using social networks? Awesome. Who's afraid of social networks? A couple hands. Okay, well, we're going to try to help. Robert Musil, the Austrian writer who wrote, among other things, The Man Without Qualities, between the years of 1921 and 1942, has anybody read The Man Without Qualities? Awesome. Okay. So you know, those of you who have read it and those of you who haven't, that it's a very large book. It's a monumental work that was 3 volumes, and it was left unfinished upon his death in 1942. It's about 1,500 plus pages and takes place all within the year of 1913, during the twilight of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Musil was an interesting man. He was a scientist, an expert in engineering, behavioral psychology, and philosophy, yet he chose to spend his life writing fiction. And what he wanted to do in particular was kind of portray the inexact process by which an individual human being goes through life within the envelope of his or her own perceptions, experiences, sensations, and thoughts. And so in this wonderful tome, in the 100th chapter, we meet we go with General Stumm on his visit of Austria's old imperial library. The library, of course, being a wonderful metaphor for knowledge and information today that we would otherwise associate perhaps now with the internet. General Stumm enters into the library and he says, "We marched down the ranks in that colossal storehouse of books, and I don't mind telling you, I was not particularly overwhelmed. But then still, after a while, I couldn't help starting to do some figuring in my head." And the general thinks, well, how long would it take, if I read a book a day, how long would it take me to read all of these books in this library? And so he asks the librarian, and what do you think he tells him about how many books they have in this crazy library? Because now he's getting a little bit unnerved in the face of all of this information. And the library tells him 3.5 million. And General Stumm says, it would take me 10,000 years to arrive at that number of books. So there's this kind of feeling then that comes over General Stumm. He says he felt nailed to the spot. The whole world seemed to be one enormous practical joke. And he's saying, I don't mind telling you that there was something radically wrong somewhere. So there's something wrong with all of this information that we've created. And there's this feeling of overwhelm. But, so we have here with General Stumm, we'll go back. General Stumm, this chapter gives us a wonderful illustration of the feeling of information overload in the early 20th century. But my question is, may it have existed before? Can we trace this feeling further back than the early 20th century? We certainly feel like it today. But, and what I want to say after doing a lot of research on it is that human beings have experienced information overload since ancient times. And curiously enough, in each era that it's felt and experienced, it seems to be experienced as something new and particular to one's own era. So it's this kind of curious thing that throughout the ages that's pretty constant. For example, overload is nothing new. If we even look at Plato back in 370 BC, if we depend on writing, we'll lose our ability to remember anything. So Plato's reaction to this first technology of writing, that we would somehow lose our memory. In Ecclesiastes 12:12, we read, "Of making many books there is no end." That's the 4th or 3rd century BC. Seneca, in the 1st century AD, "Distringit librorum multitudo The abundance of books is a distraction. René Descartes, more recently in the 17th century, even if all knowledge could be found in books where it is mixed with so many useless things, as the internet today, is it not? And confusingly heaped with such large volumes, it would take longer to read those books than we have time to live. And so therefore, it would end more effort to select the useful things than to find them oneself. So clearly kind of this need for a better search. Denis Diderot, as you all know, one of the authors of the Encyclopedia, a great 18th century effort to select, sort, summarize, and search information. As long as the centuries continue to unfold, the number of books will grow continually, and one can predict that a time will come when it will be almost as difficult to learn anything from books as from the direct study of the whole universe. It will be almost as convenient to search for some bit of truth concealed in nature as it will be to find it hidden away in an immense multitude of bound volumes. And so, how many books can we read? I mean, if we take the example of the US Library of Congress, the current print and book holdings are 34.5 million. If we assume that someone could read one book every week from the age of 10 until 100, which would be quite ambitious. I don't know if anybody has tried that. But then we'd arrive at about reading at about 4,680 books in a lifetime, which is a staggering, comparison. So, what can we say? Are we really the first to experience information overload? And I would argue that no. And I would argue even further that one can make the transcendental argument that information overload is simply part of the human condition. Unlike animals who are, guided by instinct, human beings are always already confronted by too many possibilities. So we always perceive our environment as overly complex. Precisely the reduction of that complexity that is the basic challenge of the human condition and always has been. So digital overload, or our feelings of overload today, seem to be just a new edition thereof. Human beings are endlessly curious and will always be creating information. Therefore, we'll always need to create new and innovative, more efficient ways to store, select, summarize, and search. So it's kind of no wonder that Google is as important as it is. It's simply one of the most fundamental parts of the human condition. So even though one can argue that information overload has been experienced throughout the ages, I'd like to turn now to look at an era, the early modern period, which for the purposes of this talk will define, let's say, around 1450 to 1750, because that is a period that seems to have very strong echoes with our period today, and we might be able to learn a few things and kind of take away a few nice bits of information from that period. So why is the 17th century somewhat like today? The 17th century was a time of great discovery and change, and was was situated in the wake of one of the most transformative technologies anyone had known till the time, the printing press. And there was, from about the late 13th century to the beginning in the 13th century, there began to be many correspondence networks that were put into place. So we had the Copernican revolution, which radically changed people's perspective. The discovery of the New World, again, radically changed people's perspective. The recovery of ancient texts, which now increased information dramatically. All of this increased information dramatically. In ancient text increased information and multiplied sources of authority. So those living in the early 17th century were the inheritors of all of this explosion, this proliferation of information, and we may learn a thing or two about how they dealt with it and what they learned. So one thing I'd like to posit before I begin with that is that in my study, in my research, it seems to me that information overload, instead of being perceived as something negative, and I think this picks up on what J.P. Rangaswamy was just talking about, instead of being perceived as something negative, it rather should be perceived, or might be best perceived, as something positive, in that it seems to be consistently a generative force that sparks innovation. So instead of crumbling under this perceived notion of information overload, one can identify new needs and lead and create many new innovations. And we see that today constantly with the internet, and we saw it back in the early 17th century. So, for example, I'd like to begin with Théophraste Renaudot. I'm not sure how many of you remember Théophraste or ever learned about Théophraste, but perhaps you know his name from the Prix Renaudot, which is a complimentary literary prize to the Prix Goncourt. Théophraste lived 1585 to 1653, and I'm not going to go into specifics of his life too much, but he was a very interesting character in that he was able, in a time when absolutism was beginning to define itself and society was much more rigid than it is today, and they were suffering from this information overload from the Renaissance. Nonetheless, he was able to identify a need and capitalize on it, and was quite an entrepreneur in the early 17th century. He was a doctor, and he did much good work in terms of helping people. But the two innovations that I'd like to talk about are, one, his conferences that he began in 1632, and two, the Gazette that he began in 1633, or 1631, which he's credited now as being the first French journalist, having created the first true weekly French newspaper. So these conferences, he said if man is truly said to be a social animal, his soul being the best part of him, then his education can be attained only by conference, which is the commerce of souls. So you can think of yourselves here today, back in 1641, 1632, that was the first time in Paris in the 17th century, there was a public space that was almost a proto-Habermas public sphere, where people from different social rank, different backgrounds got together, about 100 people, to discuss every issue under the sun, truly, from bearded girls at the circus to do men or women love the same, or more scientific topic. And science was always used as kind of a prism through which one looked at these things. However, they also talked about, on emptiness, on the stars, etc. So just as at LIFT, after the conference, at LIFT now, and we're being live streamed, and anybody can see what we're talking about, but to his credit, and back in 1632-33, Théophraste, the conferences took place on Monday afternoon. The next day, he would print up the entire proceedings, the talk by the main speaker, the 5 talks of the intervening speakers, and he would print them up on his printing press, which was inside his bureau d'adresse where the conferences took place, and disseminate the information as far and widely as he could. So he said, it has been found good not only to record on paper so many fine thoughts, but also to print and publish them with a popularity known to all. These conferences then got disseminated into England, Holland, across France, and sparked new conferences in other areas. And I think we can think of perhaps an example, a contemporary example of that, of such conferences sparking different conferences. So not only did he innovate conferences in the early 17th century, but he innovated journalism. He published the first edition of his Gazette on May 31st of 1631, and this Gazette was very interesting because it served both to inform the French of what was going on mainly internationally, but it was also kind of a publicity vehicle for Richelieu and Louis XIII, who they themselves contributed to the Gazette. What's interesting in the quote, I think, is that his sense that from now on he wanted to give a record of events of the day that would fly as in an instant from the north to the south, that is to say, to all the ends of the earth, which reminds me a lot of our view of the web. So the interesting thing about the Gazette, as I said, the news was international. He would give news of Rome, Constantinople, Spain, Portugal, Germany, etc. at first without any news of France. Why? Because he was making use of these established correspondence networks that had been well in place since the end of the 13th century. So to say that social networks have just begun with the internet is just false. So what were these correspondence networks that were in the 14th, 17th century? How was this information getting around, and so quickly for that time? At first, it was, and many of you probably know this, merchants, especially based out of Venice, were the carriers of information. They were the ones bringing back little news stories, little letters from their travels. So Venice, in the beginning, was at the center of these networks, and there was kind of an axis that developed: Venice, northern Italy, France, West Germany, Flanders, and England. And that was just to speak of the European axis. However, we all know that it went further. In the 16th and 17th century, the network started to shift from a merchant-based network to more of intellectual correspondence. France became the center, but the axis still remained pretty much the same. And so Théophraste Renaudot, yes, he's credited with the first journal, but prior to him, there were many news journalists with handwritten manuscripts, which traveled just as quickly as a lot of print manuscripts or print newspapers. So one can say that these were the four mothers of our bloggers and our journalists and our Twitter our tweets, because a lot of the news was pretty quick. News would come in. These are some quotes. I have news from Lyon. The trade fair has been very, very good. A lot of textiles have been sold and a good deal of money gained too. I have news from France that 9 ambassadors are coming to Italy with 200 horses to make peace for everyone. And I mean, these are very tweet-esque, aren't they? And they also sparked the same kind of emotional and a response that tweets coming out of the Arab world did as well. These tweets were not innocuous. They would spark massive changes in pricing of products and massive emotional distress if there was bad news that someone had been killed, and perhaps he hadn't been killed, because there was lots of misinformation, just as there is today. You can imagine that letters were crossing with anonymous newsletters, and finally, who could you go to verify this information? So we're not the only ones who need to sift through what we find on the web and verify what's going on. So for example, merchants, ambassadors, and cardinals were the most trusted sources, and also the place from which the news originated would also guarantee or serve as some sort of guarantee that the news was legitimate. Italy had by far the densest correspondence network, and by far and away the most news coming out of Théophraste's Gazette was news about Italy. So what did these correspondence networks do? They facilitated cultural exchange across many boundaries. They broke boundaries, religious boundaries, social boundaries, geographic boundaries. The familiar letter was introduced at this time, so there was a play with, people knew very well that they were developing both a public and a private persona. So that should give everybody kind of a little bit of comfort to know that other people were on Facebook at a certain time and had to manipulate different persona, both their public and their private. And Montaigne was a big proponent of the familiar letter, and that letters should be spontaneous and familiar and give entry into the person. So correspondence networks also created social groups. Teachers would write to teachers, different types of groups would write to each other, and that would start forming different social groups across the world. Correspondence networks collected and diffused information, created public opinion. They were an instrument of cultural change, and it also needs to be said briefly that illiterate people also participated. They were not left out. A lot of times people think it was just the rich, the wealthy, the literate who participated in this, but no. If someone who was illiterate wanted to write a letter, they just needed to go and ask their priest, their school teacher, a student, or their pastor, and they could have a letter sent. But also, these letters were circulating, and people would wait the day that they were coming, once a week, once a month, twice a month, and immediately the letter was read aloud. Letters were never meant to be fully private. No one could guarantee that a letter was private, just as today. So I hope that gives you comfort that in terms of privacy, nothing is ever private once it's outside of your control. So illiterate people would be able to hear the news because it was then passed on orally very quickly. Athanasius Kircher, I won't go into his life, but he's a fascinating figure from Mainz, Germany. He was a Jesuit polymath, one of the last people who knew absolutely everything. He was famous for his gallery of wonders, scientific things. But the interesting thing for us here today is that Kircher corresponded with about 760 correspondents, many of them scientists, all over the world. And Kircher is a good example of how one could also then use interconnected networks. He made extensive use of that network I explained earlier in Europe, and he also made very good use of the communication network that was facilitated by Jesuit missions and universities throughout the world. So we do have a sense that information was being sent all over the world, very global. Just to jump to Voltaire, make the same point that here's a slide of Voltaire's correspondence. And one interesting thing to note in this slide is that by far and away the most volume of his correspondence was local, between Geneva and Paris. So just wanted to remind you that it's not just that people were writing letters for them to go far away, but also next door, just as I think today we continue to email people who live right next door. So to bring this up to date, Facebook slide from their recent IPO showing the interconnected nature of the world today brought to us by the digital revolution. But an interesting quote, by and large, I don't know if you've probably read the IPO letter, and I think there's a lot of similarity with what I'm saying today, but I have to take issue with this part where he says, a network built from the bottom up, they want to create a network built from the bottom up or a peer-to-peer network rather than the monolithic top-down structure that has existed to date. And I hope if I've done anything, I've helped to dispel that myth that there was ever a monolithic top-down structure in terms of social networks. So from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg, information overload and social networks have always existed and are an integral part of the human condition. Information overload is a generative force that sparks innovation. Letters function as both an exchange of information and as a means of cultural exchange. So we'll continue to see that, and that is an impetus for Facebook, and I think a very correct one. Letters are never private, so perhaps imagine the compendium of all of your tweets and letters and emails down the road. So the question would be, does the increasing quantity of information today, coupled with ever-quickening rates of dissemination, mean that we are living in a time of extraordinary information overload? Or are we, relatively speaking, as well off or better off than our early modern counterparts? And just to leave you with this slide of Voltaire, Le Lever de Voltaire, he's getting out of bed, barely getting dressed, and he's already dictating his first letter of the day to his secretary. So we're not the first to wake up in the morning and check our email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and stay there. Wow. I think it's one of the talks that I had the most fun preparing because I learned so much, and you put things in perspective like in a very powerful way. So basically, the printing press was invented, and what followed was a period of overload, which was then followed by a period of innovation. So I didn't invent anything. Conferences were invented by Théophraste Renaudot. If I thought I was a genius, then I'm knocked down. Blogs were invented by that guy. He invented journalism, tweets, the personas managing different identities, and interest groups, so many things. It's just one more iteration that we're seeing right now. When we prepared also, you mentioned one thing, is that you said it's about the time where, as someone who had a public existence, you didn't have the choice but to join the public debate. Can you explain a bit on that?
Yeah, so one thing that we wanted to include, I don't know how many of you remember Pierre Corneille, the great playwright of the 17th century in France, but he wrote a play in 1637, Le Cid, and that play was greatly debated in the public sphere. It was kind of the first time that people felt the need to really debate something in the public sphere, and Corneille couldn't just say no to that. So what was interesting, two things that were interesting. One, yes, you were forced into the public arena. You were forced to participate in a blog. You were forced to give your views. And at that time, too, the way that one, in the early 17th century, if one criticized Le Cid by means of a poem, then you would have to respond with a poem, or if it was a letter, you'd respond with a letter. So that also brings out something completely different. Yes, you were forced to. It was much more public. Letters were crisscrossing Paris at 1,000 a day, but also the genres were much more. They were much more varied in the early 17th century, and I would say that as we go through the 18th and 19th century, even the 20th century, it's the form of the genre of the letter that really, and I think today now, with all of these new online forums, we're kind of back a little bit in the early 17th century where we've got different genres. We've got tweets, we've got blogs, we've got letters, we've got journals, we've got so many different things.
Yeah. So, right now we hear a lot of companies, for example, saying like, I don't want to go on social media, and people are talking about me, but so I have to go. I'm forced to join. But this is actually not a very new phenomenon. You made all these parallels, so you explain how history is basically repeating itself. Can you also tell us a bit about the differences? So, what differences do you see between today's social networks and the old 17th century social networks?
I mean, I think I can state the obvious, I think, which would be that today, obviously, we're much more interconnected. I mean, just given the difference in the slides between Facebook and, Kircher's correspondence, we have a rate of acceleration that's just much more amped up. But I'm not sure that leads to, my question then would be, does that necessarily lead to more overload? Because at the same time, one has to concede that being able to check something quickly on your mobile device, also offsets a certain amount of overload at the same time. So I wanted to say, yes,
just spread it more over time, maybe.
Yeah, or your life is made easier in certain respects, so therefore in those other places where it might be more perceived more.
So
yeah.
Quickly, what is the solution these people find? So they were feeling really uneasy about the quantity of books. So was the solution to reduce the number of books? Obviously not. So the solution was inside each of us regarding overload. We have to change our view on the quantity of information, and we have to accept the fact that it's part of life.
Right. Well, each generation reacts to the information overload presented to them differently. So the 17th century, we have Descartes saying at the beginning of the Discourse on Method, common sense is available to everybody. So let's just arrive at these scientific findings through our reason. So, and we have Renaudot saying, no, we're not gonna use any jargon here. We're gonna just speak plainly. We're gonna if we present all sides of the story, truth will arise. So there's a sense of like just saying, okay, we're done with all of those authorities. We're going to find truth a different way. In a sense, so I think over time people adapt, but it has to be said that nobody has ever read, it's a myth to think anybody has ever read all the books. In fact, styles of reading or different ways of reading, people have always dog-eared pages, quickly looked through things, so yeah.
That's a very big question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anaïs St. Jude,
Thank
please
you.
give her a big round of applause. Thank you very much.